hundreds of years after the floodwaters finally receded and Noah's Ark came to rest on dry land, something strange happened that almost nobody talks about in church. The giants came back. I'm not talking about metaphorical giants or some kind of poetic language. I mean actual, towering beings that terrified entire armies. And once you see the verses for yourself, you can't unsee them. Buried right inside your Bible is a puzzle that has made scholars, rabbis, and theologians scratch their heads for over 2,000 years. If God wiped the world clean with a global flood, how did the Nephilim, those mysterious hybrid giants from Genesis, somehow walk the earth again? That question alone is enough to make a room go silent. And it once did for me. I was in the middle of a discussion about angels and demons when I casually mentioned something. That made one man nearly fall out of his chair. I said the Nephilim returned after the flood. His eyes went wide. He leaned forward and challenged me. Show me one verse in the Bible that says that just one. The room froze. People love the idea of the Nephilim. They show up in books like Enoch and in ancient Jewish writings. But he was right about one thing. If it isn't in the Bible, it doesn't really count for most believers. So, I opened my Bible and gave him not one, but two verses. The first comes right at the beginning of the flood story in Genesis 6, verse 4. It says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward." Most people read that verse their whole lives and never even noticed those last two words. And afterward, the verse doesn't say they were only there before the flood. It quietly hints they were still around after. But that's just a teaser. The real shock comes hundreds of years later, after Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. When the spies enter the promised land in the Book of Numbers, they come back trembling with fear. They say they saw the Nephilim there, specifically the sons of Enoch, who come from the Nephilim. They then describe themselves as feeling like grasshoppers in comparison. This isn't poetry, it's raw terror, and it means the giants survived. This creates a huge problem, because the flood was supposed to wipe out the corruption of the earth, and in Genesis, that corruption was directly tied to the Nephilim, the offspring of rebellious angels and human women. So if they're back, does that mean God failed? Did the flood somehow miss something? Or is there a deeper story hiding just beneath the surface? Ancient people wrestled with this exact same question. One of the oldest attempts to explain it comes from a strange document called the Genesis Apocryphon, which was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In it, Noah's own father becomes suspicious about Noah's birth. He wonders if his wife was secretly impregnated by one of the Watchers, the angelic beings who descended to earth. He fears that Noah himself might be part Nephilim. Now, it sounds like something out of an ancient soap opera, but it shows something incredibly important. Even 2,000 years ago, people knew the giants came back. They just didn't know how. Most scholars today don't believe Noah was half angel. That text was written much later and reads more like theological fan fiction than actual history. But it tells us something crucial. The return of the Nephilim wasn't just invented by modern YouTube channels. It was a mystery that was already haunting the ancient readers of Genesis. Another explanation comes from the language used to describe the flood itself. We're told the waters covered all the high mountains under the whole heaven. That sounds like the entire planet, right? But biblical scholars like Michael Heiser point out something really interesting. In the Bible, the word all doesn't always mean every single thing on earth. For example, in Genesis 41, it says all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain. Obviously, that didn't include people in Australia or the Americas. It meant all of the known world to the biblical authors, their entire cultural and geographical horizon. So, how did the giants survive the flood? There are a few theories, and they get progressively stranger. The first is what we could call the local flood theory. Some scholars believe the flood was absolutely devastating. Original, it wiped out the entire world as no one knew it, including the Nephilim who ruled those lands. But it's possible that pockets of humanity, and maybe even other giants, existed beyond Noah's horizon. From Noah's perspective, everything was gone. The world was cleansed. From God's perspective, the primary threat, the heart of the rebellion, had been crushed, even if not every single being on the planet was erased. This theory makes sense of some geological evidence and explains how other civilizations could have existed at the same time. But what if the flood was global? How could any giant have survived? This leads to the second theory, genetic survival. This idea suggests that the Nephilim genes didn't die out completely. Maybe one of Noah's son's wives carried the corrupted DNA. Now, the Bible says Noah and his family were blameless or perfect in their generations, which many take to mean genetically pure. but the text isn't explicit about the wives. If one of them had a recessive Nephilim gene, it could have reappeared in later generations, explaining why giants show up again in Canaan. It's a bit like a hidden genetic glitch that resurfaces down the line. It would mean the problem wasn't entirely solved by the flood, just postponed. But there is a third theory, and this one is far darker and far more unsettling. And it comes from a verse that most people have never connected to the Nephilim at all. It comes from the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he says something truly bizarre. He tells women they should cover their heads because of the angels. That line has confused people for centuries. Why would angels care about a woman's hair? To understand this, we have to step back into the ancient world. In ancient Jewish tradition, angels were not chubby babies with wings playing harps. They were powerful, sometimes terrifying, spiritual beings, and some of them had a history of rebellion. We see this in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God, widely interpreted as these fallen angels or watchers, saw human women and desired them. They took wives and had children. Those children were the Nephilim, giant, violent, corrupt beings who filled the earth with bloodshed and chaos. Now, here's the strange part. Ancient people, including prominent writers like Hippocrates, Aristotle, and the early church father Tertullian, believed that hair was directly connected to the reproductive system. Long, uncovered hair was often seen as a symbol of fertility and sexual availability. It wasn't just a hairstyle, it was a powerful, nonverbal signal. So when Paul warns the Corinthian women to cover their heads in worship, he might be referencing this ancient, explosive history. He could be saying, don't repeat what happened before the flood. Cover that symbol of temptation. Don't let the watchers be drawn to you again, because the consequences last time were catastrophic. This idea connects with another ancient Jewish text discovered with the Dead Sea Scrolls, known as the Damascus document. It talks about the watchers falling again, after the flood, because of lust for human women. And listen to how it describes their children. Their sons were as tall as cedars, and their bodies like mountains. That sounds exactly like the description of the giants in the Book of Numbers. This leads us to the repopulation theory, the idea that the Nephilim returned because the same sin that created them before the flood happened again after it. Fallen angels once more took human women and produced a second wave of hybrid offspring. The flood wiped out the first generation, but the spiritual rebellion didn't stop. And that is where the story becomes truly terrifying. Because if this is true, then the Nephilim weren't just an ancient problem that Noah's flood took care of. They were a recurring one, a persistent, spiritual cancer. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land after their exodus from Egypt, they weren't just fighting regular human tribes. They were confronting the last remnants of this corrupted bloodline that began before the flood and was reborn after it. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Og, the giant king of Bashan. These weren't fairy tales or exaggerations. They were real enemies that Moses, Joshua, and later David had to face. Their defeat wasn't just a military campaign. It was a theological one. It was God finishing the cleanup job that the flood began. This is why God commanded Israel to utterly destroy these specific tribes. It wasn't just conquest. It was spiritual warfare, eradicating a demonic bloodline from the Holy Land. That's why this story is so important. Because it doesn't just end in Genesis or with David and Goliath. It runs all the way to the New Testament, to the life of Jesus himself. If you look at the Gospels, you'll notice Jesus going out of his way to confront demonic strongholds in regions historically associated with these ancient giants. Places like Bashan, which was known as the place of the serpent, and Caesarea Philippi, a center for pagan worship built at the foot of a mountain linked to the old gods. It was there, standing on land once ruled by the Nephilim's descendants, that Jesus declared, "The gates of hell will not prevail against my church." He was staking his claim on enemy territory. So, how did the giants survive the flood? The Bible never gives us a single, clean answer. Maybe the flood wasn't global in the way we imagine it. Maybe the corrupted genetics survived through Noah's family. Or maybe, most chillingly, the rebellion of the Watchers continued, and new Nephilim were born into the world. But one thing is certain, the story of the Nephilim did not end in the water. It was fought on the battlefields of Canaan, and ultimately, it finds its final answer at the cross. If you want to understand what happened to the last of the giants, and why their story is secretly woven into the mission of Jesus, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell, because the deeper you go into this ancient mystery, the more you realize the Bible is telling a story far bigger, stranger, and more epic than most of us were ever taught. Thanks for watching.